shall never be another dawn.
Hey class, welcome to the final lecture of our series. I'm glad you're able to make it this far. This lecture will be shorter than most of the others for two reasons, right? One, mainly because this is the last lecture and I know you guys are tired and you want to prep up for your final exam. And so this lecture will include some bits that tie things together that will be able to sort of seal the deal on some of the exam questions. So you should actually listen to this one, right? It's easy to just kind of blow off the last week of class, but that's why I'm trying to keep it short. And then number two, if you ever want to go on in U.S. history, right, you gotta know some of this stuff, and U.S. history too is going to cover it. But I want to kind of set you up for success, right? I don't trust every handling of this period, right? The period after the Civil War, what's called Reconstruction. Many times it's kind of poorly kind of cobbled together, and you don't understand the sort of transition within American politics, right? All of a sudden, just seems to be slavery's over, the slave issue's done, North and South decide to go their own ways, and there's some truth to that. But I really want to hammer down the conceptual similarities that carry on from the 1860s into the 1870s, and the kind of social and political movements that continue to motivate people. Usually, the period is just condemned as basically a time of compromise, a time of corruption, a time where what will be called the robber barons begin making their massive fortunes in things like steel, railroads, and oil. So the names Carnegie, uh, Rockefeller, Morgan, this is when they get their real launch point. But right, it's not just that. It's also a period where people are starting to figure out what kind of America do we want to live in, right? This question continues, right? And it's crushed, it's suppressed, but you got to understand the dynamics. What do they want? And ultimately, right, I want to leave you off on a slightly hopeful and a slightly pessimistic note, right? Both light and dark. At the same time that many of these movements get crushed, the Civil War almost to some extent is a failure in actually resolving anything, right? Abolishes slavery, but other forms of kinds of economic coercion, the fact that people are stuck, right? We'll see sharecropping, but also a level of hope, right? People start to come together. They start actually piecing some of the problems together, and continue on in that vein of Jeffersonian political thought that says, what is America? America is about making sure every person is in their own place, right? And that's that can be developed in several different ways, but we'll see some of how that plays out into the next era of American history. So, like I said, I'll try to be short. No, it won't be over an hour, as you see, but it will kind of hang together the final threads of our class. So, right, the next question: the Civil War is over, right? The war becomes a war of liberation. Lincoln helps get the 13th Amendment passed, right? Slavery is abolished at the end of the Civil War. But then the question is, right, so what, right? What's the next step? For people like William Lloyd Garrison and his one of the main abolitionists, and he has this magazine called The Liberator, right? It's over, right? Mission accomplished. We won. Slavery's done with. And for some, not that this was Garrison per se, but there were some abolitionists who were more concerned not about the effects of slavery on the enslaved, even though that was wrong. It was the effect upon the enslaver, right? So a lot of these plays, they try to reach people and morally persuade them that slavery is wrong. It's because it makes you, as the master, into kind of a loser, right? You become morally degenerate. You are lazy. You're abusive. You start acting less like a citizen and more like some aristocratic noble. Commanding the people you own around like, literally like slaves, right? You own these people's property, and so this actually makes you a worse person, and it ruins all of your relationships. You become, horrible in all sorts of ways. So there are people who think, okay, once we get rid of slavery, right, the problem is over. But there are many people who are starting to say, well, no, you got to do something, right? This makes up the main component of what is known as radical Republicans. Right? You got to do something. The freed slaves need to be integrated into American society. But on top of that, what are we going to do with all the traitors, right? We had a whole rebellion break out. And so what are we going to do with their leaders? How are these states ever going to come back into the Union? Right? Do you execute all of the leadership? Well, no, that would cause probably another breakout of civil war. So who do you punish? How do you welcome the states back in? All these questions are swirling around when the unthinkable happens, right? Abraham Lincoln, he goes to see a play put on at Ford Theater in Washington, D.C., when a kind of a part-time actor by the name of Booth, John Wilkes Booth, he comes up behind Lincoln while he's sitting in his presidential box at the theater, blows his brains out in the back of the head, and then jumps down. He actually sprains his ankle when he lands on the stage, which hobbles his ability to get away as efficiently as he wanted to, but he yells out, Sic semper tyrannis, right? That's always the tyrants. And so as this sort of Southern nationalist who sees Lincoln almost as a tyrant, almost as a dictator, he kills him. And this is a major blow because Lincoln had been radicalizing over the Civil War. He had kind of shifted from being a faceless, moderate Republican that could hold many people together towards pushing things, right, seeing a kind of larger picture to the Civil War, larger picture to the Republicans as a party, and kind of advancing more and more towards free soil, towards redistribution of lands to fulfill this Jeffersonian dream for black citizens, right? For the newly freed, right? He's not gonna. Originally Lincoln, he's a big admirer of Henry Clay, and as an admirer of Clay, he believes in colonization. So okay, we'll free the slaves and then we'll send them back to Africa, right? Problem solved. Because America's not going to be able to function, with these kinds of racial demographics. But Lincoln is kind of coming around, right? Frederick Douglass has meetings with Lincoln, and this seems to be moving him in a different direction. On top of it, Lincoln is actually introducing new economic ideas about he's introducing new ideas involving the use of currency. So the shift to greenbacks isn't just we need money for the war, but it was also trying to make the United States less dependent upon Great Britain. Britain was the great gold magnate of the 19th century. And so if all currency is based off gold and Britain holds most of the gold, then that will make any kind of breakdown in their relationship. If the U.S. wants to drift further apart from Great Britain, it will be harder if they depend upon gold, right? So people are starting to think about the future of greenbacks. Originally, they're just introduced as a wartime measure, partially because of Britain, partially just because the government's having a hard time raising funds. But people are starting to think if it's more permanent. Nevertheless, Lincoln's assassination leads the nation in a kind of state of shock, right? Lincoln becomes this great martyr type figure, the first president to be assassinated. We've seen presidents die, William Henry Harrison or Zachary Taylor, but those are from health issues. But Lincoln, right, unequivocally murdered by somebody who wants to basically right the wrongs of the North winning the Civil War. So Booth is eventually caught and tried, but this leaves his administration in the hands of Andrew Johnson. Now, Johnson was put on the ticket in 1864 to try to bring about national unity. Lincoln was concerned when he was running, not only that he would lose, but that the border states, the states that stayed with the Union, would be more inclined to leave if the North begins to pass more aggressive measures. So, I mentioned Maryland becomes basically a kind of police state, mainly because if Maryland goes, Washington, D.C. is surrounded on all sides by Confederate territory. But these border states, they still had slaves. Their slaves weren't linked into the cotton economy, so they had less incentive to go with the Confederacy. A lot of, these were the states that tended to vote for the Unionist parties. Like, even though Virginia was ultimately goes its way, right? West Virginia remains part of the Union, even though they choose a free state platform. But you got places like Kentucky, and else Maryland, Delaware that still have slavery. And so you want to woo him back, and you pick a kind of moderate candidate to help keep some of the Democrats who are in the North kind of happy with the Lincoln administration. But the idea was never for Andrew Johnson to rule. Andrew Johnson was from Tennessee. He was never someone who was in favor of the slave power, and he was a Democratic Unionist. He was more of the kinds who would have voted for Stephen A. Douglas, but that ship sailed. So now he gets welcomed into the Lincoln administration, and now he's running things. Johnson did not particularly care over the issue of integration, right? The slaves were freed. He kind of stuck it to these plantation owners in the South who treated him like crap. And that's all he basically wanted, right? Johnson looked for an apology. He wanted these Southern leaders to basically just tell him, Andrew Johnson, that I'm sorry for being a rebel. I'm sorry for doing all this stuff. I'm sorry for rubbing your nose in it. And for the price of an apology, you and your state can come back into the Union. So Johnson was willing to pardon a lot of things, and basically put the United States back together in the same way it was in 1850, minus slavery. But right, the war was of a massive cost, and a lot of Republicans are not going to allow the South to just come in, right, with a sorry and an apology and I won't do it again, and then back into business, right? Instead, radical Republicans, motivated by the idea of black citizenship, but also motivated by the idea of punishing the South for involving the North in a disastrous war, basically puts Johnson in check. Radical Republicans impeached Johnson for some of his vetoes as an abuse of executive authority. The impeachment doesn't succeed. It's probably the closest impeachment there actually is that's not built so much on partisan lines, but on a real concern about the future of the nation. But nevertheless, radical Republicans dominate Congress, and so for many of Johnson's vetoes, the Republicans are able to outvote the president's vetoes, right? So normally in Congress, you just got to get over 50%. If the president vetoes, you need 2/3, right? Over 66% makes it a lot harder, but radical Republicans were motivated. And they begin to push through Reconstruction. And Reconstruction, right, has a lot of different components, but it's trying to rebuild the South in a way that reflects not only free soil principles, right, and the idea that one person, one family should own a plot of land that they can work, right? None of this massive plantation ownership. But it's also to punish the South for going to war with the North in the first place, right? These wealthy elite planters that back secession, they should be forced to pay for the war, right? And so Reconstruction has this huge land redistribution program, but it's not just punitive. Some historians thought, oh, they're just doing this because they're mad. They want to take the money from the wealthy who were, rebels. They were fighting against the government, and so they should get punished. But it was also in fulfilling the free soil idea that a lot of these ex-slaves, right, a lot of these newly enfranchised black citizens, they need a stake in the country, right? According to Jeffersonian ideas about what economic democracy looks like, is you got to be self-possessed if you want to be a capable voter, right? That's why, you don't want slaves voting because they're literally owned by people. But if you're in a similar kind of relationship where your boss, your employer, whatever, the guy who rents land to you, if he can boss you around, he can get you to vote one way or the other, right? You're never going to be able to learn to stand up for yourself. You're never going to learn how to think through these political issues for yourself. And so then you're just basically trapped. So that was the idea. And so now radical Republicans, whether intentionally believing that's what they're doing or unintentionally pursuing other goals, that's basically what they advance. They want to see these plantations broken up. They want to see these Southern elites kind of put in the dirt, and they want to see these newly enfranchised black citizens kind of come on to their own, right? That their families are sort of brought together. They're able to own their own home, own their own land, farm their own land for themselves, and be able to provide, right, in their own way. And so that's what the Reconstruction Act was mainly about. And many different components also. In 1865, even before the Reconstruction Act, you see the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau, as we'll see, is about kind of using the federal government to sort of protect these new small interests from local elites that would want to take that away. So, right, here's the death of Lincoln, right, as it's dramatized. John Wilkes Booth capping Lincoln in the back, and then Lincoln doesn't die immediately. He's kind of in and out of a coma, as you might expect when you get a bullet in the back of your brain. But he's kind of in and out of life for a couple of hours, and so people would show up, probably not like this, but people would show up to try to hope he'd get better, but eventually he dies and he becomes this American martyr. So Johnson's administration provokes this radical Republican whiplash, right? The Reconstruction Act is passed despite Johnson's protests, but he's basically locked in a corner. So then when time for election comes up, 1868, right? Nobody wants Johnson, not the North, not anyone. And so he's out, and instead he's replaced with a far more popular and far more committed to social transformation, the former general, commander of the armies, Ulysses S. Grant. And so Grant, right, if you know anything about him, I'm not going to get too much into him, but he's sometimes unfairly maligned as overseeing a very corrupt administration. And somebody who basically just, he was kind of, he drank a lot, so he was drunk a lot of times. He also liked to race his carriage around Washington, D.C., so he was kind of a daredevil. That was the closest thing to drag racing you could get. And, while he was doing this, he turned his administration over to a lot of his military buddies who just became cronies, right? They got rewarded because they were loyal to him in the army. And so then they used this opportunity, running the federal government, to basically line their own pockets, right? Make a lot of money. There were some very lucrative positions where you basically controlled the comings and goings of trade, and so you would just skim some off the top and become a rich man overnight. And so some of this is true. So some of this is very, very true. In the next election in 1872, you'll have what's called liberal Republicans. And one of their main things was to clean up the corruption in civil service, right? You don't get appointed to a position unless you're actually competent at doing it. It's not just because your buddy works in a higher office and then can kind of give it to you. And you're not allowed to just take money out of the government, right? The reason of serving in government, the reason in serving in public office is to benefit the Commonwealth, to benefit the public, not to make yourself rich. But nevertheless, right, Grant really oversees and pushes through these radical Republican reforms, right? He's actually committed. He believes in this idea that you got to integrate these freed blacks, and you cannot let the South just come back in on its own terms. You can't hit the reset button and go back to 1850 without slavery, right? And so Grant is unfairly maligned because he actually was invested in this stuff. He didn't just sort of get drunk and ride around on his horse and let other people do things for him, right? He was an active cause for trying to defend the rights of the newly freed people. And so he helps, push through legislation to kind of prevent those local elites who want to keep freed black men and women from kind of inheriting their citizens' rights. And he's really advancing these things, right? So when we'll see some terrorist activity rises up in the South, Grant responds forcefully. And then over this period, right, for about 5 years, the federal government invests itself in trying to protect the rights of the newly freed blacks throughout the South by not only protecting their right by trying to advance the redistribution agenda, but also try to create opportunities for them to sort of synthesize with everyone else into America. So that's what the goal of the Freedmen's Bureau was. As it says, right, it becomes sort of a welfare station, right? So people, and this is at the very bottom, or very, very deep bottom, right? People who are literally broke, they have no money, they were slaves. We'll put them on the dole to help you get you back on your feet. It will help get you a loan so you can purchase your own piece of land. The Freedmen's Bureau built schools, as I wrote, right, and helped settle racial tensions. If local elites or local white population starts getting into a fight with the local black population over access to resources, the Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to adjudicate, right? They're supposed to solve this, right? They're trying to make it fair so that everyone can basically have their own piece of the pie, right? White citizen, black citizen, all are now citizens. All can pursue this dream of free soil, right? One of the main things of the Republican Party is being the party of free labor and free soil. No slavery, not just because it's bad for at a moral reason, but it actually breaks down the whole political economy of the United States, right? The idea is that you can own your own way and own your own stuff and can be able to provide for you and your family, not having to work for somebody else, right? That was the idea, and Grant tries to help push this along, at least in the South. The North is a different issue, right? Industrialization is already afoot. So if you're going to go on and take U.S. history too, you really need to know about this. That in the North, right, Grant kind of allows, he's still very popular. He's still kind of pushing some of this, old school Republican ideas, but the sort of the party's starting to shift far more in the interest of industrial business, right? And so the Civil War saw the rise of J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller, who made a lot of money buying up federal land on the cheap. And why were they allowed to do that? Because during the Civil War, right, they needed to make the government needed to make a lot of money quickly to be able to maintain its debt overhead, and so it had to sell things off just to keep the war effort rolling along. And of course, right, they needed to do this, and then unscrupulous people like J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, they just gobble it up, right? And this is for the purposes of building railroads, which was big business, but we're not going to get into any of that. And then the oil to run the railroads on, and also to becomes this increasingly important source of energy throughout the United States. So you'll learn way more about that in U.S. history too. And really, U.S. history too is just the history of J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller and their children and their successors, and it has a huge imprint on American history. The idea of and this goes back to Hamilton. This goes back to the very early period of the Republic. That your question is the government existing for the public benefit from the lowest to the highest, right? To the wealthiest to the poorest, right? Is that who it's supposed to serve, or has it become an instrument in almost this trickle down way, right? It's supposed to serve private interests who are the more powerful, influential, and perhaps most entrenched power bases within the country. And then what helps them is supposed to help everybody else. So you feed the rich, you feed the powerful, right? It's supposed to work for them, and then everyone else benefits when the rich benefit, right? These are two different visions of a country. They go all the way back to the beginning, and they will continue into the next period. And so you cannot understand it without Rockefeller and his Standard Oil Company. You cannot understand it without J.P. Morgan, who single-handedly, in a few instances, bails out the entire government. That's how wealthy Morgan is. Morgan has so much money, the government says, we're broke, you got to get us a loan. So Morgan and his friends are able to coordinate and get the country a loan, right? It's nuts. It's crazy. But that's a whole other period, and you see this rising up during the 1860s and 1870s. So as you see from this electoral map, right, Grant crushes it, and Grant's even successful in the South. Now, so if these, see, Texas, Virginia, these are what they're called unreconstructed states. So right under the radical Republicans and under Grant, Southern states could not just say, oh, we're sorry for what we did, please accept us. No, they had to create new constitutions for their states that reflected the new reality of freed slaves who are now citizens, fully citizens with the right to vote, who have the same legal protections as any other American citizen, and a state that's based on something other than slavery, right? Now we'll see that this collapses, but right, even the South, right, with these newly enfranchised black voters, they vote Republican, right, for pretty obvious reasons, and they will see the South actually, almost join with the North as part of a single agenda advancing the radical Republicans. But we'll see that fall apart. The other thing to note, right, not that you know anything about this guy, it's not that important, but this guy Seymour, he's from New York. New York remains sort of the bastion of Democratic politics in the North, for the next couple of decades. And most Democratic candidates are going to be from New York. They're usually governors or mayors of New York City or senators. But the main point to take away from this is that the South knows that they can't actually run Southern candidates. No, they'll be totally opposed by the North and find it kind of distasteful. So the power balance is kind of swung, kind of fulfilling what Van Buren wanted in a lot of ways. Is the South cannot run the Democratic Party if the Democratic Party wants to survive in this newly free United States, then it has to work with its allies up north, mainly in New York. So while the Democratic Party, after the failure of Reconstruction, will be voting almost entirely blue, it will almost entirely be Democratic. All of its candidates, with a few exceptions, will be from New York. So again, and also I mentioned 1872. There's some pushback against Grant because liberal Republicans are concerned with the corruption in the Grant administration, and they're also concerned about the growth of the federal government, right? And so we won't get into this, but the Civil War really does see a kind of revolutionary change in the use of the federal government, where it goes from these United States to the United States, and the federal government starts really, as a solid block becoming the national government. And so states' powers are rapidly disappearing, right? There is a sense where the states' rights was a major concern, and so liberal Republicans were those who said, well, no, we don't want that kind of power balance change. We believed in the original constitutional settlement that sees the federal government as perhaps even the weaker partner, but at least sort of the basically equal partners with the states, not its overlord. So there was some concern about that, but that's a whole other history you'll have to get into the U.S. too. Nevertheless, liberal Republicans run. They don't do so poorly. There's a whole complex issue about how liberal Republicans as a movement gets taken over by interests opposed to it. But the real issue is this, right? The guy who runs against them, Horace Greeley, he dies before the election even happens. So when the election takes place, the Electoral College tries to place its vote. They have to sort of split up into a bunch of other candidates, right? So for some reason, Georgia sends 3 votes to Greeley anyway, even though he's not alive anymore. But the Democrats kind of joined forces with the liberal Republicans because they were opposed to Grant and his radical Republican agenda. But most liberal Republicans fall back in line. They back Grant because they don't really like Greeley. And so this is a solid win for Grant and the radical Republicans. But this is where things start to fall apart. What was going on in the South, right, that made Grant have to advance the radical Republican agenda through the federal government, right, through the Freedmen's Bureau, and ultimately through the U.S. Army? Well, let's look at a couple of them. One is sharecropping. You should learn about this in U.S. history too, but it's never understood well enough to explain the rise of the Populist Party, right? Which is a key thing in U.S. history too. You should learn about it. But for the purposes of our class, sharecropping was basically a blow against this idea of economic democracy. And this affected not only freed slaves, but also poor whites who were trying to get access to land on their own terms. The idea of sharecropping is renting. So you would go to your former master, right? And he'd say, either you can I'll just rent the land to you, and then you give me a portion of the crops you make, or right, the planters start selling off pieces of their lands. But of course, if you're a freed slave or you're a poor guy, right, you can't afford to buy a new chunk of land. And then think of the startup costs, right? A lot of it's upfront, right? If you want to succeed as a farmer, not only do you need land, but you need the seeds to plant the crops, right? You got to actually plant something. And then you also have to have farming equipment, which ranges from plows and hoes and shovels, but also farm animals, right? Oxen who can kind of pull the plow across the land, a mule to sort of help carry things, right? Farm animals are basically tools. Before the invention of mechanical farming implements, eventually you get these reapers and you get these, you get steam-powered plows and all this other crazy stuff. But before that, right, most people don't use that. It's expensive. They're going to use an animal, right, a tried and true method. But how are you going to afford it? The planter says, look, I'll sell you the land, I'll sell you the seed, I'll sell you the animals, but you got to give me a percentage back to pay off the loan every loan cycle. And so this is a debt trap, right? This might seem very foreign to you, right? Because you don't think, probably most of you, if none of you, have ever had a business. You've never really engaged in a bank to try to take out a loan to engage in a startup. So it's basically like this, but maybe something more relatable to some of you is what happens with credit cards, right? You use a credit card, you rack up some debt, right? You spend $1,000 on whatever, um, and the credit card company says this, right? Hey, look, you don't have to pay the $1,000 off at the end of the month. And you think, oh, good, because I didn't really plan to do that anyway. They say, well, look, just pay off a minimum balance and you can keep spending, right? And maybe they'll even increase the amount on the credit card that you can keep spending. So you have a credit ceiling of $10,000 or $20,000. So you spend $1,000 and they say all you got to pay is $35. You say, great, I got $35. I don't want to pay $1,000 back. But of course, the problem is interest. This is the idea of usury. This is the idea that you loan money at interest. So okay, you don't pay it back, but all the stuff you didn't pay back, now a percentage is going to be added to it. So like 5%. So if you owe 5% of $1,000, now you owe, right, 1,050, right? And some of these interest rates could be astronomical. They could be 10%, 12%, 14, 15, 16, right? There's not a lot of laws protecting debtors, right? And of course, you got to keep working in this debt trap, because if you fall behind and they repo your stuff, right, boom, you're done. Right? They'll just take your farm, they'll sell it to somebody else. So you got to keep working and keep working and working. And of course, when you're in this guy's pocket, he owns you. And so when it comes to voting, you might, be scared that if you vote the wrong way, and remember the secret ballot hasn't been invented yet, but it's about to be, they know who you're going to vote for, or they can kind of pressure you to vote one way or the other. So this basically traps people. And then of course on top of it, this is another term you should just know for your life. Uh, many of these loans involved compound interest. So that means what's called the principal would be the original $1,000 loan that you're trying to pay off, but you get that interest rate bump, right? You're able to pay off only part of it. So then they add on top of that whatever you still owe, but then what you owe, then the added interest gets folded back into the principal. So now the next interest rate's not on $1,000, it's on $1,050, which means the amount that you owe is going to increase. And then if that's constantly happening every month, every year, you get trapped and trapped and trapped and trapped and trapped, right? And the idea of you owning yourself, not being beheld or beholden to anyone else, right? This idea of economic democracy, it's gone, right? So both black and white farmers are trapped in this arrangement. And in a way, for many of these freed blacks, this is just like slavery, right? Sometimes you're serving your former plantation master because you don't know anyone else. Who's going to give you land? Who's going to offer you a loan? It's not like you could get in your car and drive around and shop, or they don't have computers, right? They can't shop around for a loan. Can't go visit every other bank to go find out, right? You're in the middle of nowhere in rural Georgia, and this is the best deal you're going to get. It's the only deal you're going to get. So a lot of people end up working in similar relationships to their masters. And so it doesn't really feel much different than slavery, except now the master doesn't even have to pretend to be paternal. He can just squeeze you for debt. Now, of course, you have more rights, right? You actually have citizenship rights. So this is a good change, especially if you're a lady. You're not going to get raped by your master. You're not going to get beat. Though, of course, sometimes employer-employee relationships can be pretty violent, right? So employers can beat employees. You'll see that in some factories. There's some abusive behavior, but nevertheless, right? It's definitely an advance. It's better to not be a slave than to be a slave, even if your conditions are almost equivalent to being a slave. At least when you assess it at the level of buying and selling, and within the country. But even worse, right? You say, well, I got citizenship rights. I'm a free person, right? So maybe I live like a slave. I'm trapped in this debt cycle that economically is indistinguishable from slavery, because I can't actually leave the land without getting hauled off and thrown into jail because of the debts I owe. But hey, right? I'm a citizen though, right? I can be treated as an equal. Wrong, right? When Grant starts pulling back, the South tries to advance what are called black codes, right? This is what's also known as Jim Crow. The idea is that the local laws of these states begin to be passed in such a way that, though formally they're not discriminatory, so they don't violate the 14th Amendment, which means everyone has to be treated as the same under the law. All people are equal under the law, at least all men. These laws skirt around that by introducing things that are basically targeted towards the freed slaves, but at least on paper they could say, well, that's not what they're about. So one of it involves redlining, which means, basically preventing freed slaves from buying and selling certain pieces of property where they can live, right, by kind of discriminatory housing practices and ownership practices. There were laws that made the testimony of black men not valid in a court of law, right? Because the idea is, well, you're supposed to be tried by a jury of your peers. You're supposed to be examined by your equals. And then they would come up with laws that basically say, no, if you're black, you can't testify against a white man. So if something happens to you, you're out of luck. Another major thing was trying to restrict the voting practices of newly enfranchised black citizens. One way was reading tests. So, not in a lot of ways, the average poor white citizen was not that much better off than the average black citizen, right? It's not like you're going to complicated schools. You might know how to read some very basic things, but a lot of people were illiterate, right? Because you didn't need to know how to read to be able to farm your land and get on with your life, right? And there weren't a lot of schools being built in the South, right? A lot of the schooling from the public school movement to make sure all citizens at least are literate, they know how to read basic instructions, so they can, at least so they can vote, they can understand the issues, they can read pamphlets and newspapers and so on. You didn't see a lot of that in the South, right? That their way of organizing things didn't follow that. Mainly because it was more rural. It was harder to get people to school unless you had the money to be able to send your son off. But if you're a small farm, you don't have the luxury of being able to send your kid off. He's got to work, right? He can't go off to school, and you can't pay for a tutor because you're just barely making it anyway, right? And of course, if you're sharecropping, you're doubly screwed because all the money you make is probably paying off the debts you owe. So the way that they could get around this, though, was that you just, be racially selective. So, they'll have a poor white guy come up to vote, and they say, okay, well, you got to be able to read the vote. So what does this say? And it'll be like a basic sentence, or it'll be like a single word. So they can figure that out. Boom. But then when the black citizen shows up, they say, okay, well, you got to be able to read this. And they'll show him a passage from Shakespeare. Of course, that's not easy to read. And so he fails the reading test, and so he can't vote. So you start locking out black voters that way. Another way was what was called a poll tax, where every citizen by existing has to pay a tax. And so a lot of the poor blacks were then disenfranchised because, hey, you can't afford this tax. If you avoid the tax, then you can't vote. Eventually, later on, poll taxes will be deemed unconstitutional because basically the whole point of a poll tax is to keep poor people who can't afford to pay the tax off the voting record. But all these things start to limit participation of black citizens in American life, basically trying to hive them off and stripping away their citizens' rights. And then on top of it, if that wasn't bad enough, the Democratic Party in the South basically creates a terrorist group. The Ku Klux Klan is known as the terrorist wing of the Democratic Party. This institution is actually different from the later Ku Klux Klan that's reborn in the 20th century and still exists. That's very different. Not that the modern Ku Klux Klan is much better, but the original Ku Klux Klan was specifically designed to basically scare blacks away from the courts, to scare blacks away from the schoolhouses, to scare blacks away from the voting booths. They would, the whole point of the original costume was to dress up like a ghost. They would, make wailing noises and claim to be the ghosts of Confederate generals and officers who died in the war. And so there's a little bit of like a Scooby-Doo element where they're just riding around as a ghost trying to scare people. But more importantly, they were terrorists. They would shoot people, they would hang them, they would burn their property, right? And so if you're a black citizen and you see your neighbor's house get torched, you see him get, stabbed or shot, beat up, right? Or maybe even killed, are you gonna follow in his footsteps, or are you gonna take a risk going to vote? Right? Because they know who went out to vote, right? They got spies, people are watching. And the Ku Klux Klan's a secret organization, so nobody knows who's a part of it. Though many Southern elites who are now disenfranchised become big advocates for the Ku Klux Klan. Additionally, the Ku Klux Klan, with the Democratic Party in the South, helps print literature to create this fear. Right? They talk about, right, if these newly enfranchised blacks are allowed to do whatever they want, they're going to buy up all your land, they're going to rape your wives, they're going to steal all of your stuff, you're going to be in the dirt, and they're going to take over, right? You're going to basically be subordinated in almost reverse slavery by these newly freed black men. And so these were paranoid myths. Of course, wasn't what was going on. But for some disenfranchised whites, right, they can't understand why they're so poor and everything else is going wrong for them. And all it takes is both the carrot and the stick. The carrot of uh, upper society saying, "Hey, man, at least you're white, right? You should vote with us. Vote for the Democratic Party, even though it doesn't benefit you, right? At least it's your people, right? You want your people in control, not these savages." And then the stick of basically trying to create the fear that there are a lot of possible horrible things going to happen if you side with the blacks, if you live side by side with them. Now, actually, this takes a while to work, right? Normally, people think the South is just incorrigibly racist, so the idea that white farmers and black farmers, even though their lives are basically identical, right? They're both sharecropping, they're both living as debt peons, they're both serving these elite plantation masters who've basically just shifted gear, right? They're not owning slaves anymore, but they own all these debt servants. Even though their lives are indistinguishable, right? They'd say, oh, well, the racial issue took precedence. And in some cases it did, but in other cases it doesn't, right? So there were workers' strikes in the sugar fields of Louisiana that almost crippled Louisiana government. It took violence from a state militia to break up these striking unionized workers. And these people were both white and black. And a lot of farmers started seeing their cause as united because all farmers, it doesn't matter your race, doesn't matter your creed, all of you have the same way of life, you're still invested in the same set of principles, and you want freedom for everyone. So this will be the backbone of what will become the Populist Party in the 1880s and 1890s. But this propaganda is starting to get pumped out by groups like the Ku Klux Klan to try to rally back some some white people who don't really have an investment in the Democratic Party. There's no reason to vote for them, but you try to create enough fear, you try to create enough opening where people say, "Oh, there's hope, right? The Democratic Party can represent us too." Um, and so these movements start to cripple the efforts of Reconstruction. And so, to make a long story short, right, all of these things start happening, right? Grant sends the troops down south, but the North is getting tired, right? The radical Republicans start losing their popularity. The interests of industrialization and these massive business owners start taking precedence within the Republican Party, which from this point on mainly begins to represent business interests. And radical Republicans start getting shut out, right? This isn't helpful for healing the wounds of the nation, right? We're not gonna do it this way. On top of it, the U.S. is starting to become interested in filling out the rest of the continent. So after the Civil War into the 1870s, the U.S. will start sending military units, right? And this is Sherman goes out west. This is where a colonel by the name of Custer will go out and die, in these battles. But they all start moving out west, fighting Indian nations and trying to protect northern free soil farmers who've now set their eyes on moving to places like Kansas, Nebraska, but then also other parts of the country, the Dakotas, Montana, Oklahoma, and so on, right? And so free soil becomes wrapped up with westward expansion, and the North is starting to take less and less interest in the issue of redistribution and working out the former Confederate soldiers, right? Then we punished some of them, the rest of them we pardoned, right? Again, these issues are too complicated, they're too exhausting, and people start giving up on them, right? And even though Grant continued to push, right, he wins re-election in 72 on these issues. By 1876, things start going bad for it, right? 73, there's a huge economic depression, and so Reconstruction efforts rapidly start unwinding, right? So they're legally true, but you have to enforce the law for the law to be effective, and the northern federal government becomes less and less interested in doing this. And so if you're not going to protect the citizenship rights of blacks who are voting in the South, then they're going to basically stop voting because of terrorism, because of all sorts of unfair practices to keep them actually from the booth. And you start becoming apathetic, right? How am I going to actually stop any of these movements, right? And so the Democratic Party, which is far more organized than the Republicans in the South, ends up sweeping back into power. And so the South solidly becomes Democratic. Therefore, in 1876, there's another election. The South basically votes Democratic. It runs again a New York candidate, representing the South's interests. A kind of combination of plantation owners, running with their debt slaves, farming stuff like cotton, though at a much lower rate than it used to be. And then combined with New York financiers who ran places like New York City through their political machine called Tammany Hall, which you'll learn a lot more about in U.S. history too. And it was really in the issues. It was really in the interest of free trade, right? The same things, keeping low tariffs, which is not what the Republican Party wanted, right? The Republican Party was still invested in kind of building up national industries, not having just about selling agricultural goods to Europe and elsewhere. So anyway, the election's very close. The Republicans run a former Civil War general by the name of Rutherford B. Hayes, but Hayes, there's basically ambiguity about who won the election. So the way Hayes basically cashes this out, it says, look, we've already basically stopped enforcing Reconstruction. If I pull the rest of the troops out, they go back to their bases, they stop interfering in the South's local affairs, give me the election and we have a deal. So the Democrats say, all right, we got a deal. So boom, 1877, the bargain happens. Rutherford B. Hayes is elected president, and the South is able to kind of control its own interests, which damages, right, the lives of many average black farmers who then are reduced to something that to many seem to be nothing better than slavery, right? And so this political cartoon by a famous cartoonist that in U.S. history too you'll learn a lot about, right? You'll probably see some of his work. His name's Thomas Nast. But in this cartoon, right, the conditions are now worse than slavery. You got the KKK terrorists, you got the White League, which is sort of the political face, right? These are people running candidates, and they just want to go back to the way it was, which was basically white supremacy and keeping black citizens in essentially a state of subordination and dominance, right? So this is very emotional. You got the family being, held over a skull and crossbones. But, right, finally to conclude, populists in the South, there's what's called the Greenback Party, who are interested in the goals of the original Republican Party, right? Free labor, free soil, right? The idea of the nation as a public entity, not working on behalf of the rich, but for everyone. They will turn against this, and they will try to run candidates against both the dominant Republican and Democrat Party. Now, this will ultimately fail, but you'll learn a lot more about this in the next class, I hope. A lot of people have nothing good to say about populists, but they're actually the only ones that were advancing the original goals of the party of Lincoln and the original Republicans under Thomas Jefferson. Anyway, that's the class. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a lot. I hope it made you think about some of the contemporary issues in America right now. Normally in the last day of class, I get everyone donuts, but so you'll just have to go out and enjoy a donut on your own, with some coffee or tea or something. But I had a real joy teaching this class. I hope you really enjoyed it. And for the last time, signing off, this is Professor John Parks. Hope to see you around Northampton. Bye.